Are you a new sewer and want some help and guidance for your beginner capsule wardrobe collection? Are you a seasoned sewist who just wants help putting a capsule together for the spring season? Or do you just like watching sew-alongs? If you're ticked yes to any of these, then you're in the right place. This is part 2 of my Seasons of East Summer in New York sew-along series. And if you've not already got all your notions, fabrics and got your pattern cut out, then I'll bob the link to part 1 in the description below. Go and have a watch of that one, get yourself to the point where you've got your pattern cut out, and then come back here and meet me and we'll carry on. Hi there, I'm Christine the Gemini Stitcher and welcome to my sewing space. Today we're going to sew our Seasons of East Summer in New York dress together. And the first thing that we need to do is grab our pattern pieces and get all our notches and markings sewn on them before we take the paper pattern pieces off them. So let's go over to the cutting table and do our marks and notches together. So here we are at the cutting table. You're going to need all your pattern pieces with the paper pattern still pinned on them. You're also going to need a hand sewing needle with a contrasting thread threaded in it, your scissors and your fabric marker pen. So the first piece we're going to do is the front bodice. On the front bodice, you've just got your neck marking notch to mark up, snip into it. Then under the arm, you have a notch that's for the zip marking, snip into that one. And then on the top shoulder, you've just got a notch marking, which is for lining up. Now they've all been snipped, but because we're going to finish our seams before we sew them together, it's a good idea to also mark these notches with your fabric pen. So get your fabric pen, find the first notch and mark it on the inside of both pieces of fabric. Do the same with the notch at the top. It doesn't have to be a huge mark, just so that you can see it when you finish your seams, and then the same with that neck marking. The next one is the back bodice piece. And on this one, you've got your notch under the arm for where the zip's going to go, and your notch at the top shoulder for lining up your shoulders. And that's the only notches on this one. So again, make sure you mark your fabric with your fabric pen with a little line as well, so that you don't lose the notches. Is the skirt front. Now the skirt front has got the tuck lines in it there, and we'll deal with that in a minute. The only other thing on the front is the notch marking for the side split. So we'll just snip that one in there and mark it like we've done the others. And then we're going to move on to this tuck. There's 2 lines for the tuck. So at the top, grab your pattern piece and do your little snips in the top so you know where the top of the tuck is. And then the bottom, I'm just going to get a pin and make a little hole at the bottom of each line and then mark it with the pen, pressing on quite firmly. And then when we take this away, I've got my 2 marks there and my notches at the top. So grab your ruler and draw a line from the top of the notch down to the dot, and do the same for the other one. Now we're going to replicate that on the other side, turn the pattern over, and then that is the front pattern piece, skirt pattern piece, all marked up. The last piece that needs marking up is our back skirt piece, and there are 2 markings that you need to do on the back. You need to do the snip for the slit marking at the side, and again mark it with your fabric pen. And the other thing that needs doing is the dart on the back. So I've opened up my pattern piece, placed it on one side, find the notch markings for your size at the top and snip in with them. And then where the bottom point is, again, make your little hole with a pin. And then just use your pen to mark the dot. So there's my dot. And at the top there I've got my 2 snips. Grab your ruler again. We're going to draw this dart in. So from the notch on one side diagonally, draw that line in and do the same on the other side. So there's my first dart done. I'm going to replicate that on the other side, and then that's all our markings done. So that's all our markings done on our pattern pieces. The next thing that we're going to do is pre-finish some of the seams. So we're going to pre-finish all the seams apart from the waist seam on the front bodice pieces, all the seams on the back bodice piece apart from the waist, and the 2 side seams on both the front and the back skirt. Now I'm doing this in a little bit of a different order than the pattern instructions. If you want to follow the instructions, then that's fine. This is my way of doing it. To speed it up a little bit, we're going to do all the finishing all at the same time. Okay, so let's run through what I've overlocked. So I've got the front skirt piece and I've done both of the side seams finished off. This is the front bodice, and I've done all the seams apart from the one that joins at the waist, so all round the sleeves, all round the top, shoulder and the underarm. I've done that on both of the front pieces. I've got the back bodice piece and I've done all across the huge back, shoulder and neck section, the ends of the sleeves and the underarm seams, but left the waist seam unfinished. And then finally I've done both of the side seams for the back skirt piece. So that's all our seam finishing, all done, all in one go. The next thing we're going to do is the top bodice. So these are our two top bodice pieces, and this is the neckline seam along here. Now, the instructions just tell you to sew up to the notch line marked on the front, press the seam open and press your seam's neckline to create the V over by 1.5 centimetres. Now this has been cut on a slight angle, which means this fabric could potentially stretch out. So to prevent that happening, we're going to be using our forming tape, which is, it's just like narrow strip of interfacing with some chain stitching through it, and you use it instead of stay stitching. This pattern doesn't tell you to stay stitch, but I like to use this anyway, just to make sure that my neckline doesn't stretch out. So it irons on, and you iron the chain link nearest the edge, and I'm just going to iron that. I'm going to iron it right, apply it on right to the bottom of, top to bottom of that edge on both sides. So I'll go and do that now and then come back and we'll talk about how we're going to pin this and sew it together. So I'm at the iron, I've placed my forming tape along the neck edge. I've got my iron on a medium setting. I'm going to put a piece of spare cotton fabric over the top because I don't want this to stick to my iron. And then just gently press it on. That's all it takes. And that's how you apply your forming tape. Now, because my fabric is quite floaty, I'm also going to use best press on all my seams. So because it's got the forming tape on the inside, I've turned it over to the outside. I'm just going to do a few squirts just down where the edge is that we're going to sew on both pieces, and iron it dry. And that will then make that seam stiffer and easier to sew. Now we've added some structure to those seams, we're going to put them right sides together so you can see your forming tape on the outside. Find where your notch marking is, and then you're going to pin. Now I put my pins in horizontally to the garment so that you don't sew over them, or if you do, you may not break a needle as much as you would if they were the other way. Don't sew over pins as a rule, it's not a good idea for your machine. So that's where the notch is, and I'm going to sew from the notch down to the bottom with a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. Don't forget, your seam allowance is 1.5 centimetres, so figure out where that is on your machine. You can use the seam gauge if you want a seam guide to help you keep your seams straight, or you can put a piece of washi tape or tape on your machine so you know where 1.5 centimetres is. Now we're going to press this seam open that we've just sewn, and then we're going to carry on doing a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance all the way to the top of the neckline. To try and make sure that that is exactly what you do, measure your 1.5 centimetre seam allowance at the top of the neckline and pin it in place. That way, you can pin it all the way down if you want, but I find just pinning it at the top and a gentle tug brings it all into line, and then you can just press one side and all the way down to the bottom, and then you just need to do the same with your other side. And that's that bit done. I've now got the front of the skirt on the table, and we're going to sew in the 2 tucks that we've already marked on our fabric. So grab a pin, fold them over onto each other, put your pin through the first line, making sure it lines up with the second line underneath. In the middle, pin the top in the same way and pin the bottom down to where the bottom of the tuck is, and do the same with the other side, and then we're going to stitch those 2 in place. So we're back at the cutting table, and I've got the top bodice lay right side up, the top at this end and the bottom at that end. I've got my front skirt piece, and I'm going to put that with the bottom edge of the skirt the same end as the top edge of the top. So we're laying them pretty sides together, and I've got the edge of the skirt, so that's the bottom of the skirt at this end, and the top of the skirt, the waistband, is at this end, right sides together. So the 2 waistband pieces are being pinned together for the bodice and the skirt. So match your side seam up and put a pin in at one end, and then do the same with the other side seam, and then the bodice and the skirt should fit together nicely. So pin all the way along. If they don't fit, it might be that you've done the tucks too big or too small, whichever way's out on the skirt part, so you can go and adjust that. But if you followed your lines that we've drawn on, you should be okay. So I've got those pinned together now. I'm going to go to the machine and I'm going to sew 1.5 centimetre seam allowance along that seam. Then I'm going to the overlocker and I'm going to finish those 2 seams together and then press them down towards the skirt. Ta-da! There we go. Our front bodice is starting to look like a dress. We've got our centre neckband there and it's joined on to the skirt with a very nice seam finish there. So we're going to fold that up and set it to one side, and now we're going to work on our back bodice. The first thing that we're going to be doing is putting our tacking stitches in on the sewing machine, not by hand. So we're going to measure in 1.5 centimetres either side of the waist side, the unfinished seam on our top back bodice, 1.5 centimetres either side, and then we're going to do 2 rows of tacking stitches on the machine in between those 2 lines. So now don't forget, you've got your mark at this end, so you're going to be 1.5 centimetres in from the finished edge. Your stitch length needs to go up to 5, or your maximum length for your machine. You're not locking the stitches off at the start and finish of this. You're going to have long tails at the start, long tails at the finish. I use the edge of my machine foot just for the first row. I've changed my thread to the dark thread in the top bobbin and in the one underneath, just so that I can see the tacking stitches better when I want to pull them out. So there we go. They're my 2 rows of tacking stitches done in a dark thread. We're going to go back to the cutting table now, and I'll show you how I make my gathers even and easy. We've now got the back skirt on the table because we need to put the darts in before we can attach the back bodice to the back skirt. There's the V that I drew on earlier, and there's one at that side as well. So we're going to fold the fabric in half where the dart wants to be, right sides together. Get the fold at the point of the dart and pin from the top of the dart. I just pin the top one way, mark the bottom horizontally, and that's it marked. Do the same with the other one, and then we can get these sewn in. So I've pinned both of my darts. We're going to sew them on the machine, but I just thought I'd explain to you how I do them first. I've got 2 pins in each dart. One of them vertically along the line of the dart at the top, and then the bottom of the dart I've just marked with a horizontal pin. I'm going to start at the top of the dart with our stitch length at 2.5. We're going to sew down, and when we get about a centimetre, maybe half a centimetre from the bottom of the dart, we're going to reduce our stitch length down to 1.5 and stitch right off the end of the dart, and then pull long tails. Then snip them, take it off the machine, and then we can use those long tails to tie a knot to tie the dart off, and you'll get a perfect point every time. Don't forget, if you had dark thread in your machine, change it back over to your matching thread. I'm going to start at the waist end, the widest part of the dart. We're we're going to start with our stitch length at 2.5. Don't forget to reduce it back down because you've just done those big tacking stitches. So start at 2.5, follow the line of your dart and take your time. When you get to about 1 centimetre from where that pin is at the end, reduce your stitch length to 1.5 and sew off the end of your dart and pull long tails off at the end. So they're both my darts done. They've been done. I've tied my long tails off at the end and snipped the threads. We just need to press them towards the centre and then we can get the skirt attached to the back bodice. So I've got the back skirt underneath, right side facing upwards, and then the bodice lined up with the top of the skirt, the bottom of the bodice where the tacking stitches are. Obviously the bodice top is bigger than the skirt, but that's what the tacking stitches are for there, so we can gather it in at that point. So first of all, we're going to put a pin, line up the seams, the edges on both sides and pin them in place. Then we're going to grab the two inside threads for the gathering stitches. Don't make a mistake of picking one up from the other side, they'll lock and they won't gather. And we're just going, at this point, we're just spreading them out, we're not worried about them being exact. We'll tidy that up in a bit. But what we're doing is creating enough of a gather in that centre bit of the top bodice, just so that it fits the bottom bodice. There we go, that fits. There's not a huge amount of gather in it, but there is some gathering. Once you've got it to fit, tie off those two threads that you were pulling so that it can't come undone again and go all out of sync. Now you can start manipulating and spreading your gathers evenly across the back. Take your time with this and you'll get the perfect gathers. So once you're happy with how your gathers are spread out, then lots of pins. Along that seam. And then we're going back to the machine and we're going to sew that seam. Now we're going to sew right from the edge of the fabric, 1.5 centimetre seam allowance, and we're going to sew right through the middle of those two rows of gathering stitches. And if there's any that need manipulating as you go, take your time and move your gathers around as you sew. So you'll have one line of gathering stitches one side of your stitch line and the other on the other. So we've got our back bodice on our back skirt. You can see that that black is the gathering stitches that I need to take out because one of the rows is on the outside because of the technique that I use. But they're easy enough to take out. Grab your unpicker, unpick a few of them, get hold of the one end and pull it, and it should pull all the way out because they are just tacking stitches. Now we're moving on to the dreaded invisible zip. So grab yourself a brew, regroup, and let's get that zip put in. So taking the gathering stitches out, the last thing that we need to do on this back bodice is finish that seam together and press it down towards the skirt. So we're moving on to getting that zip in now. I've got the zip here. The first thing you need to do is get some about 1.5 centimetre wide strips of interfacing, the woven interfacing, and press them on to where the wrong side of the front and the back where your zip's going to be. So make sure they correspond, the front and the back pieces. You don't want the interfacing on opposite sides. I cut mine in half where the waist is because it's curved, and curved it round. So this bottom piece in the skirt area is 22 centimetres long, and then the top piece just goes round to where the snip is under the arm. Iron those onto both your front and your back. Now we're going to iron our zip. I know that sounds bonkers. Unzip your zip. And the idea is that it helps the zipper teeth turn over onto the wrong side so that you can't see them. But the problem with that is you can't get right up close to them when you're sewing, which is what you need to do with an invisible zip. So all I do is use my fingers, turn them all the way back over to the other side and iron along that strip. Now some people are worried about zipper teeth melting. Personally, I've never had a problem with it. Take your time. It helps. So take your time, turn it the wrong way, force it over with your fingers, and then follow it up with the iron straight away. And you won't iron the plastic teeth, you'll just be ironing the zipper tape that you've turned over on the back, if that makes sense. So that's the zip ironed. You can now zip it back up and we'll start attaching it to our dress. So I'm back at the cutting table. I've got my dresses, backs and fronts and skirts, right sides together, and I've got the seam where I've put the interfacing both together. We're going to line up the centre seam by sticking a pin through the seam on the top and lining it up with the seam on the bottom and pinning that through to secure it. So that's lining up that seam. Then we're going to pin it all the way from the armhole edge, the sleeve edge, all the way down to where the slit is at the end of the skirt. And what we're going to do is, so 1.5 centimetre seam allowance, and we're going to sew at 2.5 centimetres from the sleeve edge up to just past where the interfacing starts. We're going to lock stitch, so back stitch and lock that off. Then we're increasing it up to your 5 centimetres tacking stitch, so all the way round until you get to nearly the end of the interfacing. Change your stitch back to 2.5, back stitch, 2.5 centimetre seam stitch length, 2.5 stitch length, 1.5 seam allowance all the way down to where your notch is for your slit. So don't forget, 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. I've started at the bottom because I want my fabric at that side. Do your locking stitch at the end. Take the pins out as you go. So we're back at our beloved ironing board. We're going to press that seam open all the way up and then continue the 1.5 centimetre seam allowance all the way to the bottom where the slit is. Take your time with this and then you'll get a perfect zip. Yay! It is on a bit of a curve, so it might feel a bit awkward in parts, but just force that seam open all the way up. Once I get to the waist, I then go and start at the other end. It makes it a little bit easier. So it's pressed open on the inside. I'm going to also turn it over and make sure, pull that seam, make sure it's perfect. Because this is where your zip's going to go. Because I left that pin in, that seam there has lined up perfectly. If yours doesn't, don't beat yourself up. Nobody will know but you. It's going to be under your arm. Just give it a quick iron around where the creases are, which there will be because it's on a curve, and just get it all nice and neat before we start attaching the zip. So now the seam's all pressed open, we just need to lay the zip with the zipper teeth facing upwards towards you on that seam on the inside. Make sure the zipper teeth are lined up with the centre of the seam that you've sewn. Pin it in place, and then I hand tack the zipper in place before I sew it. So there's my hand tacking all done on that side. It is just through the seam allowance, not sewn through the front of the dress. So now we're going to turn the dress over and we're going to take the machine tacking stitches out along that seam that we've just, where the zip is. so that we can release the zip. So only where the tacking stitches were, nowhere else. So grab your trusty unpicker and get unpicking. This should come out fairly easily, but take your time. Until you get to the top of the zip. I'm back at the machine, but I just thought I'd bob on and explain something first. You can use one of these feet, and they are an invisible zip foot, and they have grooves on the back of them where the teeth go so that you can get really close into the teeth. However, you don't need one of those, and I don't have one for the beast anyway. So I've got my standard zipper foot on, but I've moved my needle as far over to the left as I can, and that's how I'm going to sew. The first thing we need to do before we sew our zip in is actually unzip it. I know that sounds mental, but that's what we're going to do. So we've undone it on the outside. Grab your zipper pull and gently pull it down to where your zip finishes. Then you need to push the zipper pull through to the inside, and you can see it there then. Grab hold of it and unzip it all the way out of the way. Okay, so now we can start sewing our zip. So you do these one side at a time. You're only sewing to the seam allowance. Start at one end of the zip. And start at the top, start at the bottom, whichever you feel more comfortable with. Get as close in as you can to those zipper teeth and turn them out as you go so that you can stitch right underneath them, and take your time. You want to get as close as you can to them without actually sewing the teeth, if that makes sense. Force them over out of the way and sew underneath. So now all we've got to do is get this zip through to the other side again. So pull it up as far as you can. When you get near, pull that zipper pull through to the other side. Turn your work over and you've got your zipper pull on the right side. Now, bit of a tug, and there we go. One invisible zip done. The only thing you can see, if you look really closely, is the little zipper pull there. There we go. It's a little bit stiff, but once it's been opened and closed a few times, there we go, that's better. All sorted and done. So I just thought I'd give you a close-up. There's the zipper pull. And there is my invisible zip all done. The only thing that I've got to do is take those tacking stitches out, and then we can move on to finish off this dress. Yay! So I've got my dress wrong sides together. This is the other seam without the zip. I've done the pin at the seam trick to get that waist seam lined up. Then we're going to pin down to the notch on this side seam. Now I'm going to do all the pinning that needs doing all in one go now. So we've got this side seam that needs pinning and sewing together. And then we've got the shoulder seams, but we're going to pin them all at the same time and sew them all at the same time, just to save a bit of time. When you get to the middle, this is where your neckband is going to be formed. So leave that seam from the front pressed over and sew over it and lock it at that end. And it will form a very nice seam at the back, and you'll have a lovely neckline. Make sure that it's lying nice and flat. And central before you sew this. So that's it all pinned, shoulder seams and this side seam without the zip. We're going to sew all those together now with a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance, press the seams, and then we'll be able to give this baby a try on. So there we go, Seasons of Ease dress all done. Lovely neat neckline done with the forming tape. Now the pattern does say to hand stitch the neckline round, but I found that it fits quite snug and actually doesn't need it, but that's a personal thing. The only thing I've got left to do is turn the sleeves up, get rid of all the loose threads of course, and do the hems. Now I have done this, the skirt, the length of the pattern. I'm only 5 foot midget, and I wanted it to be an ankle length dress for my holes, and I'm pleased with the length that it's come out. The dress on the pattern comes sort of mid-calf length there, so if I wanted it that length I'd probably have to take about 4 inches off the bottom or the shortening line, but I've left mine long. I hope you've enjoyed my little sew along and that it's inspired you to get sewing your own Seasons of East dress. This is a 3-part sew along, and there's a 3rd part to come where we're going to talk all about pattern hacking the pattern. We're going to look at making it into a top so that you could wear it with some palazzo pants as a cord, and we're going to look at making it in a jersey fabric, which exciting news means you won't need the invisible zip. I do hope my little tutorial on putting the invisible zip has helped. However, I can't claim to be the guru of it. I followed a vlog, an instruction. I followed Sew Essentials Invisible Zip Guide, and that's where I've got mine from. So I will pop the link to that as well in the details in case you need any extra assistance. When you've made your Seasons of Ease dress, please, please, please pop them into the Facebook group, and then we can all have a look at them and see how many different Seasons of Ease dresses there are going to be this spring and summer. Hope you've enjoyed. Happy sewing. Get cracking with your Seasons of Ease dress, and I will see you next week for the Seasons of Ease dress hacks vlog. Take care, everybody. Love you loads. Good luck with your sewing.